Next presentation is a response guide for detection and recovery of SOMs. SOMs is an acronym for sunken oil mats. It's by Dr. Jacqui Michel. Dr. Michel is one of the founders of RPI, has been president for the last 20 years or more. She's been part of the NOAA scientific support team since 1978, provides supports for 15 to 100 spills per year. She's provided on-scene support for at least 50 spills, has extensive knowledge and experience with fate and transport and effects issues, and has been a leader in the procedures and implementation of NRDA, another acronym, Natural Resources Damage Assessment. She has written over 250 technical reports and publications, including 45 peer-reviewed journal articles and 10 chapters in books. We are so glad to have you here, Jacqui. Thank you for the work you do in the environment and for being part of our presentation. And take it away. And you are on mute. And now you're in presentation mode. You're good.
Okay.
There we go.
So I'm on, you can hear me now?
Yep, nominal, thanks. Sorry, you somehow put yourself back on mute right when I said everything was good.
Mute, got it.
There you go, now you're off, thanks.
Thanks. Okay, I'm excited to talk about this new response guide that we did just last year with funding from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and it was part of a funding agreement with the Office of Response and Restoration for NOAA. It's a response guide for sunken oil mats, SOMs, on their formation, behavior, detection, and recovery. As Jordan gave a nice, good segue to my talk, because, oils sink bulk because, it's heavier than the receiving water, which is the most common in fresh water. The oil floats, but the density increases, or weathers or heated. That's pretty uncommon. But floating oil can interact with sediment and mostly sand, because and that makes the oil sediment mixture heavier than the receiving water. And this is the type of sunken oil mats that we're talking about. We're talking about bulk oil. We're not talking about the kind of or sunken oil that becomes involved with marine oil snow sedimentation. So in doing this project, we looked around at all the case histories that we could find data for, and there were 15. I was surprised that there were so many SOMs. And most, and we have all that in the report where we talk about the spill location and date and oil volume and type and the API gravity and how the SOMs formed and how they were removed. But in every case, it's pretty obvious that the oils were pretty heavy to begin with, and the oil was rolling around the surf zone or mixed with entrained sand in the surf zone offshore. And so that indicates that this oil sediment and sand and interaction was a key part of that. So all 15 spills where SOMs were formed were a heavy crude oil or a heavy oil, except for 2 blowouts. The Ichthyoc, of course, that was emulsified and weathered at sea. It was transported hundreds of kilometers along the coast, and it was pretty viscous, large mats, and they just kind of rolled around in the sand on the shoreline. And then Deepwater Horizon, which is where we kind of came up with the word SOMs, because that oil also was transported 100 kilometers or more, and was pretty viscous and pretty sticky. So in reading all of the case histories, the oil had weathered or emulsified at sea for days to weeks or sometimes months before it came ashore or near shore, which increased the oil's viscosity and adhesion. So they form off sand beaches, and you have to have enough wave action to suspend the sand in the surf zone or erode the oiled sand that's stranded on the beach. So SOMs, sand beaches, waves, think about that. And at most spills where the oil mixed with the sand suspended the surf zone, because not every time, it doesn't have to come ashore, it can happen offshore. And when that happened, the tidal range was less than 6 feet and most often less than 3 feet. Okay? Very small tides. And there's a sort of a physical process because of that. And also when they form, they are often deposited in the trough between the beach and the first offshore bar. Though they were also deposited in sheltered lagoons, they could be transported alongshore by longshore currents as the waves approach the shoreline at an oblique angle, and they can be transported in lagoons or estuaries or in the deep part of channels. So they're not always just right offshore. They can occur, alongshore, that transport mechanism. So we came up with, 2 graphics in the report that says, here's the onshore sand uptake process. So the oil comes ashore, it's pretty viscous, but it's viscous enough to penetrate the sand. And then that sand, that oil saturated sand gets eroded from the shoreline. You can see here the black oil getting transported and gets deposited in this first trough, because this first trough is a little bit lower energy than the waves breaking on the shoreline or the waves breaking on these offshore bars. So this is a relatively lower energy environment. And that's where the sediment accumulates. But also there's another mechanism. You don't have to have the sand, the oil come ashore in order to mix with the sand. It can happen offshore as the waves break in, and if the waves are a certain height and the bar is shallow enough that the oil can become entrained with sand that's suspended as the waves break over the bar, and then it also gets transported, into that first trough. But also some of it can go further offshore, but it's less concentrated in that offshore area. So Jordan showed this example, but here's the Morse. This is the first spill that I ever went to where we had oil, sand, sinking, that was a floating oil that interacted with sand, but not, none of this, very little of this oil actually came ashore and then sank. It happened offshore. So here's the floating oil. You can see it's nice and floating, pretty viscous. And then he showed this picture, but this was an amazing story because they had just finished a spill drill and they had the boom out real nearby. So they put their boom out in front of this beach. There's no oil on the shoreline. Okay, the oil did not come ashore into this area and then get eroded. It got mixed with sand offshore and then deposited in this lagoon. Remember I mentioned that there were sometimes it could be transported in lagoons. Well, this is a lagoon right inside San Juan Harbor. And so, and again, so when we sent out the draft report, John Harper, helped develop this kind of this sort of diagram that shows the interaction between wave exposure and sediment grain size. Because when you have muddy shorelines, you have low wave energy, and you're not going to get SOMs, and you're not going to have muddy shorelines in high wave energy environments. And we don't get SOMs formed with gravel. You can't get enough oil inside the gravel. It's too coarse. And so there's this sweet spot right here in the middle between wave exposure and really, low tidal range and sand environments. So this is where the environments in which you expect to have SOMs form. Because at a spill, we want to be able to anticipate things. We want to be able to go to the FOSC, the Unified Command, and says, you need to anticipate the formation of SOMs. And in our work, we determined that there were actually two types of SOMs. All SOMs are not the same, and they have different formation processes, behavior, re-oiling process, and removal options. And so we came up with this concept of, we have sandy SOMs. They're less than 40% oil or oil emulsion by weight. And about half of the case studies were these sandy SOMs. So here's the Hiroshima and Summer Bay Lake in Alaska. And then here's the Deepwater Horizon sandy SOMs. And in fact, the sandy SOMs here were only about 10% oil, a lot of sand. And so, they don't, they get broken up and get thrown up on the beach differently, they behave a little bit differently. So to get sandy SOMs, you have to have pretty large patches of viscous and sticky oil present near shore. They form when either the oil strands on the beach and penetrates the sand before being eroded, or interacts in the surf zone. And they're likely to be smaller particles because of the higher wave energy in the surf zone area. So to get sandy SOMs, the oil coats the sand grains, but does not fill all the available pore space. So that's why you have less than 40% oil. But one thing about them is that they don't release oil, but they can be broken to pieces by storm waves and deposited on the shoreline, after post-storm activity. So and the techniques you use are very different for removal of them because they're not very oily, they're sandy. But then there's a different kind. There's these oily SOMs. They're more than 40% oil, and usually they're a lot more than 40% oil, like in the order of like 90 to 98% oil. And they're again about half of the case studies. And so we had these oily SOMs at Lake Wabamun, the Bouchard 150 in Tampa Bay, and the Morris J. Berman. All these cases had just a few percent sand. All it took was to make the oil heavier than the receiving water. And what happens is, they form where it's really sticky oils, and the sand kind of attaches to the surface of the large thick oil patches rather than the oil, the sand penetrating in the oil. And the oil can be released. So Jordan showed this picture here. This is some of these oily SOMs in that lagoon area. And as the temperature increased, the viscosity increased, and the oil separated from the sand and floated to the surface. As you can see, we have now refloating every afternoon, refloating pure oil at the surface. And these can be quite mobile because they're not very dense. They're just dense enough to not float. So we talk about their mechanisms. So, in the next part of the guide, we talk about how are you going to find these things? So we divided it into seaward of the surf zone and in the surf zone because you use different methods. So if you're in deep enough water and there's no wave action, you can use acoustic, visual, or sampling methods, but you're really restricted when you're in the surf zone. So acoustic methods for detection in the open water environments, seaward of the surf zone, there's different kinds of sonar systems. There's sub-bottom profilers, there's 3D scanning sonars and acoustic cameras. And we go through all of those in terms of, each of the ones, what the method is, how it's operated, what are advantages for some detection, considerations for some, when they might not work, what are the limitations, and whether they've ever been used before. So these are all, we have these kind of tables. I'm a big believer in tables to make people easy to scan them and glean the information very quickly. And then I wanted to show this example, because sub-bottom profilers have not been used before. They were tested during the Deepwater Horizon. So here's a transect trace through an area where you can see where the return for the softer SOMs, dropped out because of the return signal was weaker. And they went back and verified that there actually was a SOM in that area. So there's some promising areas, but the density and size and distribution of all these SOMs, they're highly variable. So no one technique is going to be the perfect solution. But I'm pretty impressed with these 3D scanning sonars these days. I mean, here's some images, the detail is amazing that you can see. This is just some examples so you can sort of see the scale of things that you can detect, on the order of a meter or less easily. And in fact, they're using the 3D scanning sonar to monitor the environmental protection barrier around the Golden Bay in the St. Simon Sound, Georgia. So you can see on the left, we have this, 6-inch mesh system that's trying to catch the debris that might be not on the surface, but just below the surface. And they monitored it every day, twice a day, to look for debris and trained animals. And so, I mean, that's pretty amazing. These sheet piles are 36 inches, but you can sort of see the pattern of the actual mesh itself. But I'm pretty impressed. Visual methods for seabed of the surf zone. I mean, if the water's clear, you can use cameras and aerial observations and divers and surface viewing and things, because it's it's safe to put that kind of equipment in a relatively low energy environment. And if you want to be able, all those visual and remote methods, you still need to take some samples so that you can determine, to validate any sort of remote observations. So, grab samplers, cores, and sorbents. There's in the surf zone, there's, the list of things you can really do to detect them are much smaller. If it's water's real clear, you can, fly over and see them, or you can just walk along the shoreline and see them if they're very near shore. However, if they're buried, or if you want to measure if they're not that visible, you have to either take core samplers or do the famous snorkel scat that they did for a long time and during the Deepwater Horizon spill. Not too many tools in the toolbox in the surf zone for detection. The next part of the guide, we talk about recovery methods. And so if you're in the seaward of the surf zone, there's the standard issues that we evaluated all these things through the DPL 152 about how to remove that oil, 45 miles offshore and in 50 feet of water. But you can do hydraulic suction dredging. Of course, we all know the pros and cons about that. Here's the clamshell dredge that was used during the barge 3508 in the Mississippi River. A lot of times we use diver directed pumping, vacuuming. Depending on the size and everything else, you can use these airlift pneumatic dredging systems that they use a lot of times for archaeology, and then the old standby towed sorbents and nets, which are not that effective, but, sometimes that's all you got. In the surf zone, again, there's mechanical methods with these long reach excavators that were used extensively during Deepwater Horizon. You can screen the bucket so you can filter out the clean sand, and you only end up with the SOMs itself. That was pretty successful. There's one of these prototypes for the submersible dredge, but it looks pretty intrusive in terms of you're going to make a lot of oily waste and water and solids with that kind of dredge system. Then there's manual removal. People have done that quite a bit. And then sometimes you just wait for them to come ashore. That's a natural removal process. So I'm a big believer in these this stoplight charts here, where we have this matrix that says, here's the vessel removal recovery options for open water environments, each of the options here. And we evaluate whether it's, red, green, or yellow in terms of, green is good, yellow is maybe, and red is like, eh. And so this is water depth, water currents, visibility, whether these actual response technologies are available, whether there's issues with bottom construction obstructions during the deployment, what kind of patch size do you think it might be most appropriate with, whether they're good for oily or sandy SOMs, whether they're buried, whether they're in a sensitive habitat, and what kind of removal rates and what kind of waste generation. So we did that for vessel-oriented recovery systems as well as for surf zone recovery systems. So, again, it's one of these, there's an operational guide. We try to give you a little science and then some tools to try to find them and remove them with some, our best professional judgment on what might be the most effective ways to do all those things and deal with them during the response. The report is available at, at this link here at the NOAA website. Or if you can't remember all those things, you can just go on to, response.restoration.noaa.gov and search for SOMs. And I have time for questions.
You sure do. Do we, looks like maybe we have a question, Jenna?
Yeah. Do you see any areas of needed research or technology development, particularly in the recovery of the SOMs?
Oh my God, we sure do. I mean, the tools we have are kind of like, there's been very little innovation with them. I mean, we've taken tools and try to modify them to make them better, like the screens on the long reach excavators and everything else. But yeah, I would think that we need to have better ways to recover them in terms of some sort of vacuum dredge systems. Right now, all we have in the toolbox is, a clamshell dredge. But those technologies have actually been improved quite a bit. During the tank barge 3508, they had these GPS coordinate systems about, when you could tell where every bite took, so we could keep track of where we were removing the oil in the environment. But still, it's the same sort of configuration of the dredge buckets and systems themselves. We could really improve on those. And then secondly, I think, for trying to remove oil from the surf zone, I mean, there's hardly anything that people have used except a long reach excavator, and then or divers or people waiting out there with, nets trying to pick it up. It'd be nice to have some other ways to suck them up and separate the oil in the water without creating an oil slurry. That's the biggest problem, is most of the dredging pumping systems, you just create a tremendous waste stream. And if we could figure out ways to do that more elegantly, where we don't create such large volumes of waste material, that would be great.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And certainly you could extrapolate that or extend that out to all the things we do in terms of on the surface, deflection boom and containment and scat. All those are really hard to do at the bottom of a waterway as well. So yeah, a lot of opportunity for growth, but hopefully there won't be a high need for it. Thank you, Jacqui. Appreciate it.
Welcome.